Welcome to CTV's Capital Dispatch with Rachel Aiello.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Capital Dispatch. I am not overstating this when I say what has transpired on the Hill this week might be the most dramatic, social media fueled and antagonistic week on Parliament Hill that I've seen, and I've been covering the place for close to a decade. We are right in those silly season weeks. We consider silly season at the end of any sitting before MPs are about to head off for a long break. And what's gone on this week completely fits that description. As I'm recording this on about midday Friday, filibuster is continuing in the House of Commons. And in the background of this, there is all this drama around the House of Commons Speaker. So I'm going to break down for you everything you need to know about what's gone on this week. So let's start with this marathon voting session. Overnight on Thursday, the Conservatives made good on Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre's threat to sit overnight to have MPs voting on line-by-line items from the supplementary estimates, essentially the government's latest spending plans. And so what has transpired over the last 12, 16 plus hours now is consecutive voting in the House of Commons. We're watching the Conservatives vote against a number of little measures. The government, the NDP, are really making a point of pointing out all of the different things the Conservatives are choosing to vote against. This is all highly political. And the reason for this, the Conservatives say, is they want Canadians to be aware of the pain the carbon tax is causing. Essentially, what kicked this off was the government not backing down on their carbon tax. Poilievre wanted to see the Liberals pull it for families, farmers, and First Nations. Remember those three? I'm sure he'll be saying that a lot going forward. And they also wanted to have a bill in the Senate adjusted. So what happened this week on that farmers' fuel bill that we've been talking about, essentially creating a carve out for the way farmers heat their buildings, it got significantly gutted by all who have been following its consideration. Through an amendment this week, the Conservatives have said, we could pull off of this marathon session if the senators rethink and get that bill back into shape. The reason the amendment is so concerning for the Conservatives, beyond the fact that it guts out a lot of what the bill required, is that because the bill has been amended, it will have to go back to the House. And although it passed through the House once before, the current political context probably makes that less likely, and the timeline for it, because it's a private member's bill, would set it lower on the order of precedence. So really the fact that this Senate bill gutting happened this week, and then the fact that in their final opposition day motion on Thursday, the Conservatives didn't get the government to agree to axe the tax, here we are. And at this point, there are no signs of it slowing down. We are actually likely nearing history-making territory. Record setting from the last parliament, I think the longest one was about 30 hours of filibuster on the SNC-Lavalin matter. So stay tuned to ctvnews.ca. I'll be covering the latest as this vote-a-thon continues, up and down, yes and no, line by line. Ultimately, though, the government's agenda has been held up because of this, and that's largely the desired outcome for the Conservatives. But the other big story on the Hill this week, was this drama around the Speaker. So last weekend, House of Commons Speaker Greg Fergus appeared virtually through a video he had recorded at the Ontario Liberal Party Leadership Convention. And he did so in his speaker robes, speaking from the Speaker's office, congratulating his longtime friend, John Fraser, who was the outgoing interim Ontario Liberal leader. This raised much concern from largely the Conservatives, calling this an improper partisan use of the Speaker's office and its resources, which is meant to be completely independent, politically agnostic. And so this became the hottest issue in the House for the first few days of this week. We did have Fergus come forward initially and apologize and say that it was his understanding that this video was only supposed to be shared to an intimate party. He didn't know it was going to show up, he says, on the screen at a party convention in a province he doesn't live in for a party he's not a member of. But nonetheless, it's really sparked a procedural back and forth conversation in the House over whether this breached MP's privileges, whether this real air of judgment has broken Fergus's trust among MPs. They really say they need him to be completely impartial, in this move and his decision to make this video has thrown that into question. Worsening the whole thing, Greg Fergus recused himself, rightly so, but then headed to Washington, D.C. So he was there for a pre-scheduled official visit. And he did make some other comments while there, harkening back to his Liberal days, and that just really amplified what have become calls from the Bloc and the Conservatives to have him resign. We're not there yet, but this is all going to come to a head next week. Right now, the House Rules Committee is meeting largely behind closed doors to consider next steps. We're waiting to hear from them next week on what their recommendations are, whether or not he should resign, whether there should be some other remedy, or if he can just carry on repentant and moving forward into January. So we'll be watching that one next week for sure. And just lastly, in terms of big things happening in the House this week, acrimony over who's voting which way or what, there was a bit of contention over the Conservatives' vote on a bill that would implement a school food program framework. Very short piece of legislation. And the NDP and the Liberals really balked this week, saying, we've heard Poilievre up in the House day after day talking about how Canadians are going hungry, how food bank use is just up so high, and yet his party's voting against school food for kids. That's part of the story. The bill doesn't actually put food in front of kids, and I think that's where the Conservatives defending their vote has come. That's where their message has come, saying essentially a framework to set forward this plan isn't going to put any food in any kid's mouths anytime soon. And they think really if the government cared about costs of food, they would scrap the carbon tax. So just a little bit of procedural shenanigans. I wanted to highlight that one because it's an example of how each little vote, you might not notice them all, we might not cover them all, but each little one is a message. And as an MP, you are representing your entire riding. So there are a lot of considerations going into why MPs vote the way they do. And with such a heightened focus on the House right now in these last 2 weeks, that is getting spotlighted, I think more than usual, but just we're still in the middle of it. I'm quite, I don't know if you can tell by now, enthralled by some of the procedural shenanigans that go on in this place. But I also am a bit taken aback by the level of outrage and partisanship. We've seen some really strong words thrown around this week. So I do think once the break does come, all of these MPs are going to need some time to have cooler heads prevail. And then we'll get back in January and see where things stand.
Just in time for Christmas, Justin Trudeau has ensured that your turkey dinner will have a big, fat, growing carbon tax caked on top of it. That is not part of the recipe for turkey dinner that Canadians were looking for. Well, I've got news for Justin Trudeau. You've ruined Christmas for Canadians. Common sense Conservatives are going to ruin your vacation as well. You will have your rest.
So that was obviously Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre speaking to his caucus on Wednesday. I picked this clip as my quote of the week because it really was the starting off of all of this drama around these marathon votes. But I'm not only highlighting it because this was the threat he made that then saw this marathon session spark off. I'm highlighting it because of, I think, what it signals more about the version of Pierre Poilievre we've been watching over the last week or so. And that is, I think, a more combative, more attack dog, kind of hearkening back to the way Poilievre was as a Conservative MP for a number of years, and less so what we saw earlier this fall of him attempting to soften his image. And so I just think it's an interesting quote because he's talking here about, the Prime Minister is going to get no rest. We're going to ruin his holidays. And obviously that is rallying to his base. And I think some of the tactics the Conservatives have been using this week have been red meat for those diehard Conservatives. But what I'm going to be watching for to see is how this, and if this impacts their standing in the polls. Generally Canadians don't pay super close attention to some of the wrangling, the legislative back and forth that goes on here. But I wonder, just because of the height in social media coverage this has gotten, all sides really getting in on this week, how that's going to play out. But I also just think it's interesting because it's Pierre Poilievre making a threat that I'm not sure he's going to be able to completely make good on. Here he's suggesting that he is going to delay MPs' holidays, ruin the Prime Minister's vacation. Just a little bit of nerdy 101. He can threaten to keep them here. But in order to change the House sitting schedule, the calendar, either all parties need to agree or the Prime Minister needs to go to the Speaker and justify why they need more time. It's not impossible. Obviously, we'll watch what happens next week. But Pierre Poilievre alone, his party alone, while yes, they can keep MPs working overnight through the night, we'll see what other kitchen sink tools they throw at MPs next week. They don't have the ability to just keep everyone here through till Boxing Day or wherever. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're listening to some of the heated rhetoric and the politicization from leaders on both sides about what actually the rules say and don't, and what in practice some of these threats can mean. Okay, well, what am I watching for next week? I'm sure if you've made it this far in the video, you probably have a good idea. Obviously, first, we're watching to see what the heck happens with Greg Fergus. We're waiting for this report from MPs on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. If they come back earlier or by their deadline of December 14th, next Thursday, it will then spark another debate, likely in the House of Commons, about what happens next. If they recommend a resignation, we could be in for the second historic Speaker election this fall. And that will be quite something. The question there, though, is will the House have enough time to get that vote up and running and conducted before MPs go back to their ridings, or would this be something that they just are seized with as soon as they come back late January? So we'll see what happens there. Will Greg Fergus live to speak as Speaker another day? And then it's all of the government bills that have been delayed this week. What's going on? So Karina Gold, the government House Leader, has given a laundry list of items the Liberals want to see move next week. Given the runway they have left, I'm expecting likely some time allocation or other measures to try to see things fast-tracked. They want action on the fall economic statement implementation bill. Was supposed to get debated this week. That didn't happen. They want to pass the Canada-Ukraine free trade bill. They want to pass, still hasn't passed, this affordable groceries and housing bill. I feel like I've been talking about this one for weeks. And a number of other pieces of legislation that all of this drama in the House this week delayed from getting moved. And this has prompted Karina Gold, the government House Leader, to decry what Poilievre is doing as, putting off help for Canadians, dangerous, gaslighting them by threatening these votes, not being there for the first little bit. Tensions are really quite high. And so I'm watching to see if the government gets this stuff through, how they do it. And then, of course, what other measures are the Conservatives plotting to keep their promise of giving the government no rest over the lack of repealing the carbon tax. It's going to be a raucous last week, and it'll be my last dispatch of the season next week. So stay tuned for that. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the email version, make sure you do that now, because next week's is probably going to be a banger. Anyways, that's all for now. I'm back to go watch this ongoing vote in the House of Commons. Until next week, see you then.